So we need some answers about how we can better understand how we do forms. And they say the first step to understanding is acceptance. So let's just accept the fact that we have two ways to do forms here and get busy trying to figure out which one to use. In one of those ways, we take data models and bind them up to form fields and let Angular do the heavy lifting. And in the other way, we build out a form model representation and we try to take more control over data changes and validation. And at a conceptual level, we refer to these as template-driven forms and reactive forms. And these are not built into the core platform by default. They're actually provided by a separate library that's available in the core group of Angular official packages. So Angular has one scope package for forms that's @Angular/forms. And it actually has two ngModules for forms module and reactive forms module. And forms module maps to template-driven forms, and reactive forms module maps to reactive forms. And something that we hear a lot about in the description of these two is that template-driven forms gives us a way to do formy type stuff all within the markup, similar to how AngularJS provides us. And reactive forms lets us react to value changes and validation. But these are not really the best description of the two, because we can actually do a lot of the form stuff within the markup for reactive forms. And we can wire up to things, event emitters like value changes, and make use of control value accessors and view and content child query selectors to get a hold of the underlying form stuff for template forms. So if we can do a lot of the same stuff in both, why do we have two to choose from? Well, it's kind of complicated. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that complicated. Why don't we just go through and compare and contrast the two? And we're going to walk through the entire form building process from start to finish. We're going to see where we can accomplish the same UI and data collection goals for both. And we're going to discover where we have to do things a bit different to pull off the same thing. So let's start from the beginning. How do we reference them and start using them? So all the forms code comes from one scope package, so we can import @Angular/forms and as a dependency for each of these. Now there's two ngModules for each template and reactive, so things get a little bit different here in the beginning, but we can bring those in at any ngModule level that we want within our application. It doesn't have to be just the root level. And we can actually have them both in there at the same time if we wanted to. All right, with the package and the ngModules in place, we can turn our attention to our implementation within our components. So for both template and reactive, we're going to need some way to save and load data, and we'd probably do that through a service. So the implementation for both of these would get a data service injected into that. And that data service would probably have a save method that we could call from within an onSubmit method in the same fashion for each, that we could hand the form model value represented as a JavaScript object. And that JavaScript object, we'll take a look at that here in a minute when we dive into the component markup. But for now, let's cover stay in the component class and cover building the form model instantiation. For template forms, we actually don't need to do anything here in the component class. We can do it all within the markup. But that's kind of only really good for cases where we have like a new item form where we don't need to preload it with any data. So most likely we're going to want to fetch a data model from a service, so we probably have a model class field for the template component implementation. And for reactive, we're actually going to handle building out the form model representation. And to do that, we're going to make use of the form builder class that's in the reactive forms module. So we inject that here into the constructor for the reactive one. Now this is one of the main differences between template and reactive. In reactive, we're controlling the form group creation by building out the form model, form group, and that sort of thing. But in template, Angular is going to handle building that stuff for us based on what we do in the markup. But all of this stuff that we build out in reactive forms is actually the same stuff that's going to get built out by template forms. And because of this, template and reactive are actually more alike than different. See, we tend to get the impression that we can only bind up values in the markup via template forms, and we can only do things like subscribe to value changes in reactive forms. But we can actually do a lot of the same stuff in each, because the underlying code is the same for each. We just need to know how to get to it. All right, staying in the component markup or component class here for a minute, let's talk about one more thing. In reactive forms, we can do a lot of the setup stuff within the component constructor, or we can do it elsewhere and hand it into the component. And that's because we're handling this form model instantiation stuff and building out things like form groups and form controls, and we can do things like set up default values, declare validation rules, and wire up to value changes on that stuff. In template forms, we're relying on the Angular to process that component markup before we can get a hold of that underlying form group and form control stuff. So let's start a list here of decision makers and add one to it. We're gonna, if we want to wire things up early on, we want to use reactive. All right, let's dive into the markup. And first, the form element. So for the template-driven forms, we don't need to do anything on the actual form tags. All the form directives, the form module has a ngForm directive that's going to handle finding those form elements for us and creating a form group for that. And with the reactive one, we just need to take our form group that we created within our component class and wire it up to the reactive forms module form group directive. Now, both of these are going to result in a form group that's going to be the representation of our form. Difference being that in the reactive one, we created that form group right in our component class. And in the template one, the ngForm directive is going to create that for us once Angular processes that component. Okay, another thing that's different between the two is the way we go about getting a hold of the underlying form model stuff to work with it within the markup. All of the directives that come in the forms module for template forms have an export as property in their decorated metadata. And we can use a template reference variable to get a hold of that underlying form model for template forms. And with reactive forms, we've already created that form model in our component class, and so we just need to use the class field to get a hold of that. Okay, when it comes to submitting the form, we can actually do these in a similar fashion. We can make use of the ngSubmit output event that's found on both the ngForm directive for template forms and the form group directive for reactive forms. And if we make use of the form template reference variable for template or the form class field that we have for reactive, we can call form.value in the same fashion for each of these. And hand that to that onSubmit function that we have written the same way for both. And that form.value is going to be that JavaScript object representation of our entire form model. All right, so let's talk about wiring them up to form fields. So for both template and reactive, we're going to make use of directives to wire these things up. And they're different for both. There's not much that we can do here to write the same type of code. For template forms, we're going to make use of the ngModel directive and a name attribute. And that's going to handle creating a form control for us. And with reactive forms, we can either use the form control name directive and set that equal to a string that represents the name that we gave to that form control when we created it in the component class, or we can use the form control directive and set it to the actual form control object that we created. Now, getting values, default values into these is also different for the two. With template forms, we need to do that in the actual markup with the ngModel directive, set that equal to a value or a variable. And we need to do that there because we don't have any way to get to that underlying form control until Angular processes that component and that directive runs and creates it. But with reactive forms, we can do that either in the component class or wherever we created that group and those controls, or we can do it in the template through a value property binding. So let's actually update our existing list and our decision maker and say if we want to wire things up and or set the initial value early on, we want to use reactive. All right, so while we're talking about value binding, let's talk about probably the biggest difference between template and reactive. in template forms, we actually have the opportunity to two-way bind our data models to the underlying form models through the use of the banana in a box syntax around ngModel, the square bracket and parentheses. And this is good for if we have our own data models that we want to use. Template's going to be a good fit for that. So this works for scenarios in which we are upgrading an existing AngularJS application to Angular, or we have our own data model library that has built-in validation and business logic, and we just need to wire that up to form fields to do the data collection. So let's add a second decision maker to our list. When we want to bring our own data model infrastructure to the party, we want to use template. All right, so all the form stuff actually has a way to also organize some of our form fields into subset groups, and we can do that through the use of form groups. And a form group can contain multiple form controls, or it can contain other form groups. And the way we go about wiring that up is similar to how we wire up form fields. It's different for both. With template forms, we make use of the ngModel group directive, and we set that to a string that's going to represent the name that we want to use for that subgroup. And for reactive, we can use the form group name directive, set that to the name, that's a string that we gave to our form group that we could set up in our component class. Or we can use the form group directive and set that equal to the actual form group object that we created. And that's similar to how we did it on the form tag. And everything in the form is a form group down from there. All right, and when it comes to validation, we could actually make use of validator directives in the same way for both template and reactive if we wanted to. All of the built-in validators that come with the Angular Form Scope package actually have validator directives that go along with them. So we can make use of ones like required or pattern and put those on these form fields in the same fashion for both template and reactive. And when it comes to error checking, the way we go about getting a hold of the underlying form model stuff to do the error checking is a bit different for both template and reactive. With template ones, we want to use a template reference variable and set that equal to the export as of ngModel. And with reactive, we want to make use of our form class field that we have and get a hold of the individual field that we want to use from there. But after that, we can actually call all of the error checking and access to the error data in the same fashion for each. So we can do things like call .hasError in the same way for both of them because we're working with the same underlying type of object. So there's a handful of differences here, right? But it kind of feels like template's trying to hide some stuff from us. I mean, it kind of feels like we're working with the same type of form objects for each. I mean, even if we create our own form models and our own data models and we bind that, template's going to create the same underlying models that we would do with reactive forms, right? And if we ask for the export as, we're going to get those same types back. And the validation pattern could potentially be the same. And when we check for errors, we're calling the same method signatures and properties because we're working with the same underlying type of objects. So really, the role of template forms here is to provide a layer of directives that's going to handle the model instantiation stuff for us. Well, what about reactive? What's it trying to hide? Nothing much, really, but it too is providing a layer of directives. Difference being that its directives just need to broker the connection between the elements and the form control stuff that we've already created. So, after these layers, everything's the same? Really? Really, really? Check this out. Here's the source code for the ngModules for template and reactive. Both of them just declare and export a small set of directives for each. And oh hey, we see you, internal form shared module. That ngModule contains all of the common under the hood stuff. So all of the form control types, all of the validators, the validator directives, all the control value accessors, they're all in there. And they're used by both the forms module and the reactive forms module. So what does this all mean? I mean, is this madness? Are we kind of taking the whole forms concept, flipping it upside down and looking at it in a new light? Maybe, just maybe. Let's see what kind of controlled chaos we can pull off. So custom validator directives. Could we write those in one way and have them work for both template and reactive? Check this one out. Custom validator directive. We could create this thing and have it add itself to the ngValidators list, and then have a validate method within that that's going to get handed a control. And when we put this directive on form fields that are either wired up via template or reactive, it's going to receive the same underlying type of form control. So this works for both template and reactive. And I know you're probably thinking, okay, Mr. Schwarty Pants, where's the brilliance in that? I mean, that's an easy one. And I agree, that's simple, right? But check this one out. Say we want to build a form field wrapper component that we can wrap around an input of type text, and we could display a message as the user changes the data within that input field. Well, within that component, we can make use of content child and query for a ng control. And then in an ng after content init lifecycle method, we can wire up to value changes off of that control. And this worked for both template and reactive. So we just found a way to subscribe to value changes for template forms, which I thought we probably couldn't really do. So that's great, but what if we want to build components that can support, that actually have the input field or the form field within its template? Well, we can make use of control value accessors to do that. And with control value accessors, we're able to write these components in a way that can support both template and reactive. And we just need to do the plumbing ourselves to pull that off. And what I mean by that is this. If we have a custom form component that has an input of type text within it, we just need to wire up to all of its changes over here to all of the methods that are required to implement a control value accessor. And from there, we're able to wire this thing up in a parent and add our directives to wire it up for template or reactive, and it's going to work for both. And we could even put validators on there, and those are going to work. And we could use content child to query for an ng control on that custom form component. And then in the template of that custom form component, can use that control class field to check validity of things and make display decisions, like check for the has error off of that. And this is going to work for both template and reactive. Now, should we be going out of our way to be building all these things in a way that supports both and writing our code and our architecture the same across the board? Well, if we're building a reusable component library, then I would say, yeah, we probably definitely want to do that, right? But for our own app stuff, it's probably going too far. But honestly, it's a bit of a challenge for us when it comes to building forms in Angular, having these two different ways to choose from, especially when they don't appear to be that drastically different from one another. So I know you're all thinking, okay, come on, Schwarty, throw us something here, right? Give us some guidance. All right, well, let me pull up that little list we made. I think what it comes down to is this. Template forms provides us a way to do forms easy and quick in a similar fashion that AngularJS provides us. Think of it as an API abstraction over reactive forms. Under the hood, all the same reactive stuff is there. We just don't need to go through all of that setup and ceremony to get started with it. But there's a good chance that we're going to probably end up in reactive forms. It doesn't take much form complexity or rules before we find ourselves wanting more control and wanting access to that underlying model and stuff in an easy manner. So if we are porting over an existing AngularJS application, or we have our own data model library that has validation and business logic within it, then I say we would use template-driven forms. Otherwise, we want to dive into reactive forms. So even if we have something as simple as like an email newsletter sign-up form, getting started with reactive forms is easy, and it's going to set us up for future expansion. And with that, we have accepted the fact that we've got two ways to do forms. We've got a better understanding of what's really going on underneath there. And I think we're better prepared to start building our form stuff, and as we leave port and set sail on our journey across the seas of data collection. Thank you.